Good Erev Shabbos, everyone. Erev Shabbos, Parshas Vayera. Talking about the plagues, the 10 plagues that were brought against the Egyptians. There is a Gemara that discusses the plague of frogs. And the Gemara says that there were three great Jews by the name of Hanani, Mishael, and Azariah that lived in the time in Nebuchadnezzar and the time of the conquest of the destruction of the first temple. And they were in Bavel, they were during the Babylonian exile. Hanani, Mishael, and Azariah refused to bow down to an idol. Everybody was bowing down in the valley of Dura. Everybody was bowing down to idols. They refused to bow down, and they were taken, and they were given an ultimatum: either you bow down or you're going to die. You're going to get thrown into a fiery furnace. And they allowed themselves to be thrown into a fiery furnace. A miracle happened. They came out intact and alive and well, but they were going to allow themselves. They put themselves in a position where they could have been killed. The Gemara wants to know, where did Hanani, Mishael, and Azariah learn this from? How did they know that it was okay to throw themselves, that this was appropriate and acceptable to throw themselves into a fiery furnace rather than to desecrate the name of God publicly? So the Talmud says that they learned it from the frogs in this week's Parsha, that they made what's called a Kal V'chomer. They made a logical argument to themselves, and they said that frogs that are not obligated in Kiddush Hashem, they're not obligated to sanctify God's name, yet they were willing to give themselves up to sanctify God's names even by jumping into the ovens. We who are obligated to sanctify God's names, alachas kama v'kama, how much more so we should throw ourselves into a fiery furnace and allow ourselves to be killed in order to be able to sanctify God's name. The Shagasari, a great sage, once asked the question, and he said, "What are you talking about? The frogs." The Hanani, Mishael, and Azariah said that the frogs that weren't commanded to jump into the ovens. They were commanded to jump in the ovens. Just look in this week's Parsha. This week's Parsha, when God says when Moshe and Aaron go to Paro and tell him what's going to be happening, they tell him that the frogs are going to be going into Tanarecha. They're going to be going into your ovens. So it was clear that the mandate to the frogs is that they had an obligation to go into the ovens, to go everywhere. To go inside of the body of the Egyptian and the bed of the Egyptian and the houses of the Egyptian, and also into the very ovens. And if that's the case, then how could Hanani, Mishael, and Azariah have said frogs that weren't commanded to go into the ovens? They weren't commanded to go into the ovens. So the Vilna Gaon heard the Shagasariah ask this question. The Vilna Gaon, at age 7, answered the question. He said, "Oh yes, there's no question. Frogs were commanded to go into the ovens, but not specific frogs. Not this particular frog. Kermit the frog, Freddy the frog, they weren't commanded to win. Frogs, they were commanded, but not a particular, not this specific frog. And therefore, every frog was in fact a volunteer, because any frog could have gone anywhere. There could have been a house frog. There could have been a cereal frog. There could have been a kitchen frog. There could have been a bedroom frog. There could have been anything. But they chose to go and to throw themselves in the oven and to be able to dedicate themselves and to give themselves over that way. And that's where Hanani, Mishael, and Azariah learned it from. They learned it from the frogs. The Vilna Gaon loved this answer. He thought it was like, the Shagasariah thought that this was unbelievable. But when you stop to think about it, there's a problem with the answer of the Vilna Gaon. And the problem is, why did they need anything to teach them that they should be Ma'aser Nefesh? They should be willing to give their lives up. The choice was worship an idol or die. Of course they had to die. It's one of those 3 commandments that is Yareg Val Yavar, that you have to allow yourself to die rather than to transgress them. They didn't need a frog as an image to be able to know, oh, I guess if frogs could jump into an oven, we could jump into an oven also. You have to jump into the oven. You have to let yourself die, because the choice is to serve idols or to die. We know Avodah Zarah, idolatry, adultery, sexual crimes, and murder. For those 3, you're not allowed to do them. You can't transgress them ever. You have to allow yourself to die rather than transgress them. Yareg Val Yavar. So why did they need any kind of image to teach them this? Plus, what were they learning from? Frogs? Really? Like frogs were going to teach them ethics? Frogs were going to teach them the way that they should be acting towards God? What are you talking about? So, when we talk about Kiddush Hashem, I'm about to go to Poland with our yeshiva. And there we go from place to place. And you see Jews that were Mekadashim Shemayim. But it's mostly Mekadashim Shemayim Barabim. When Jews were killed, they were killed en masse. They were brought into a synagogue, and the synagogue was destroyed. They were taken to a pit, and they were shot into a pit. And very often, when we talk about Kiddush Hashem, we talk about Kiddush Hashem in groups, communities, whole entities that were wiped out, and that people were following the flow. They were going along with everyone else. It carries its own difficulty. It's an incredible thing. But to stand alone and to be able to buck the system, to be able to say, no, I'm not going to do this. So there a person could ask, why me? Why should I be the hero? Because if nobody else is doing this, why should I stand alone? When everybody is going to the slaughter, when everybody is going to be Mekadosh Shem Shemayim, to sanctify God's name, I'm along with everyone. But when I'm put in a situation where I have to do something different than everybody else, where I have to stand up, everybody else is giving into idolatry, and I have to stand up and say, you know what, I won't worship those idols, that has its own incredible complication. Because there a person can easily say, why me? Why should I be the one to be different than everybody else? What the Gemara was asking when it wanted to know where Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah learned this from, it's not where did they learn that you should throw yourself into a fiery furnace. That is Pasha, that is obvious. That's because you're obligated to sanctify God's name and not serve idols. No, what the Gemara was asking was, where did Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah get the strength from to buck the system, to be able to stand alone? It's not where did they learn Mesiras Nefesh from, but where did they learn how to have that kind of strength? Where did they get it from? That's what the Gemara wanted to know. Where did they get the strength to say, heck no, not me. I'm not going along with the flow. I'm not going with everybody else. I'm going to stand up strong and I'm going to be different. Because that's very complicated. And that they got from the frogs. That the frog said, no, I'm not just going to go with the flow. I'm going to do something different than everybody else. I'm going to take that responsibility on myself and I'm going to be the one to go into the oven. Where did Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah know to buck the system? Because that's what a Kiddush Hashem is. A Kiddush Hashem is not from, why should I be any different than anybody else? That's the stuff that Chilul Hashem is made of. But why shouldn't I be different than anybody else? I better be different than everybody else. Because I'm unique and I'm special. And I can't just follow what everybody else is doing. I've got to find my place. I've got to do my thing. I've got to express myself the way I'm supposed to. I should. I have the potential to express myself. That's what a Kiddush Hashem is. That's the message of the frogs that Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah understood. The message of the frogs is that you got to have the strength and you got to have the courage to be able to stand alone and to be able to do things against the flow. It's always amazing when you see people that are put in situations where the flow is going in one direction. And the person says, no, not me, not me. And they stand on the outside. Every one of us has that ingrained in us because Avraham Avinu did it with the whole world. Avraham Avinu stood there and the whole world was going in one direction and Avraham Avinu was going in the other. That's why he's called an Ivri. He was standing on one side of the river and everybody else was on the other side of the river. But that kind of strength is the measure of who we are. The ability to have the strength to break away from the flow. And when we do that, that's when we cause a Kiddush Hashem. That's when we sanctify the name of God. That's the lesson in the message of the frogs. Someone's got to do it, and that someone is going to be me. We hear this, and we look at ourselves in situations. We put ourselves in work. We put ourselves in our larger families. We put ourselves in our communities. We put ourselves with our friends. And there are times where things are going on and we just get caught up with them. We get caught up with ideologies, we get caught up with philosophies, we get caught up with morals and with ethics, with mitzvos, with things that we do, with actions. Frogs don't just say ridip. Frogs don't just croak. Frogs show us how to say, you know what? Let it begin with me. Frogs show us how to be Mekadesh Shem Shamayim, how to sanctify God's name by standing up for who we know we are. We should all have the strength to be able to do that, and the strength to be able to take that message of the frogs and have an incredible Shabbos, have an incredible week, a week where we're not going with the flow, we're standing and declaring, this is who I am. Have a beautiful Shabbos.